Today, I'm very proud to announce that Sakib Sherani is. Sakib Sherani is a well-known economist for being in the He has been in the intellectual scene for quite some time. ये न्यूज़पेपर्स में लिखते रहे हैं, आपने देखा होगा, और ये वैसे भी काफी कुछ countries. So with that, let me welcome Sakib. Sakib, let's begin by first getting you to give your views on your latest article, which I liked a lot, which was in the IMF book. Like me, like many economists, you have reservations with the IMF program. तो यहाँ से शुरू करें कि IMF program में what are your views? How is it going? Is it going right or wrong? And relate that to the fact that the government is celebrating that stabilization has happened and the economy is ready to take off. In fact, the term used is "udan," that it's going to fly now. So, आपका क्या ख्याल है इसके बारे में?
First, thank you, Nadeem, for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here on your podcast. Obviously, I've written quite a bit, like yourself, about the IMF, how they've got many things wrong, including their program design and the sequencing of their conditionality. And also, very fundamentally, for example, and a very generically, I'm not specifically right now talking about Pakistan, and I'll come to the Pakistan program in a bit. Policymakers in countries like Pakistan look to the IMF to implement structural reform, and I think it's a complete misnomer, or as you've written or you've stated your views many times in the past as well. Because fundamentally, the IMF is a lender of last resort. It's not there to implement structural reforms. It's not technically part of its mandate. It's now gone into mission creep, into climate finance, into gender equality, and God knows, women empowerment or whatever. But the thing is that when you have a standby arrangement of 18 months, the standard sort of standby arrangement of 12 months to 18 months, an EFF of 3 years, and you look at Pakistan's structural, impediments and Pakistan's structural reform needs, they span 10 to 15 years. So in a 3-year program, trying to fit in what Pakistan needs to do over 10 to 15 years produces some really perverse outcomes or perverse incentives and unintended consequences. For example, in our case, what it's done is this entire focus on revenue. In a quarterly sort of conditionality review framework. So it set FBR rather than achieve long-term tax reform. The government achieved long-term expenditure reform. They're incentivized to produce revenues on a short-term basis. So they don't get the chance or the incentive to fix FBR, which is the biggest albatross around the neck of Pakistan's economy. And because of that, because FBR is not fixed, it's not restructured, it's not reformed, it's going about getting even more discretionary powers now. It's just scaring the hell out of genuine investors in Pakistan. And it's shrunk, FBR has single-handedly shrunk the formal sector in Pakistan over the last 15 to 20 years and given the biggest boost you can imagine to the informal economy in Pakistan. And this informal economy does not lend itself to productivity because informal firms do not have the incentive to train their workers. This informal sector will not throw up revenues because obviously it's undocumented. And this informal sector will not bring in foreign direct investment into Pakistan. So FBR is killing all the potential, golden geese that can lay the golden eggs in Pakistan. So that's, I think, fundamentally what's wrong with the IMF program. But there are more things as well, and we'll talk about them as we go along.
But the one thing that I don't understand is, why this fixation with taxes? I mean, the rest of the world, if you look at Trump, the beautiful bill that's coming out wants to reduce taxes. I've seen in my lifetime taxes in the US being reduced 4 times. Reagan, Bush, and then Trump 1 and now Trump 2. So we've seen reduction in taxes everywhere. Here we see an increase in taxes all the time, and we fix a false target, and then we try and achieve it. But everything else is subservient. Do you agree that the IMF program should only focus on taxes? Or do you think there are other things that have more priority?
Right. So this comes to the second part of what I was going to say about this particular IMF program, but actually not this, because this is a continuation of the last 3 years of austerity. And you and I are completely on the same page, I think, on with regards to austerity, but maybe not on taxes. I think there's a nuanced difference of what when we say Pakistan's tax to GDP ratio, people like myself, maybe Dr. Pasha, etc., we're not saying that the tax burden is optimal on the formal sector. Not at all. We are completely in agreement with you when we say, that corporate tax rates in Pakistan are too high. And they should be at least half of where they are right now. What we don't agree with is that there's a large proportion of the economy, corporate players, individuals, professionals, doctors, lawyers, chartered accountants, etc., who are operating freely outside the tax net. So there's a need to bring all economic activity, or as much as we possibly can, into the net of documentation, and then taxes need to come down for everybody. That's a given. Now the other thing is, something that sort of leads into what I said earlier. What's wrong with this particular IMF focus on austerity, not just taxes, but generally on austerity? So the last 3 years, we've seen the biggest fiscal adjustment in Pakistan's history, right? A consolidation. So if you just look at the primary surplus that the government is throwing up, it's 5.5% of GDP combined in 3 years, right? We've never done more than 1.2% in the past in 3 years. Now, this is no achievement because it's done on the basis of, so if I give you a number, and in that sense, you're right. I mean, it'll just sort of reinforce your point that there's an undue focus on collecting tax revenues from existing taxpayers. I think that last caveat is really important, that proviso, right? We need to collect taxes, but not from existing taxpayers. We need to give existing taxpayers a break, especially the tax compliant, the ones who are in the documentation framework. But in the last 3 years, this government has collected more taxes than in the previous 14 years. Okay, so I mean, it's ridiculous. And then you look at the expenditure side, which is the other elephant in the room. Because what this government has done in the last 3 years, and the IMF has completely given it a free pass, just turned a complete blind eye to it. And you've written about it in one of your previous op-eds, and I've written about it as well, is that if you look at the spending, right, it's completely disingenuous of the finance minister to say that my hands are completely tied as far as the expenditure is concerned, because 60% of the budgeted expenditures are non-discretionary. That's fair enough. Debt servicing, and if you include salaries and pension increases as non-discretionary, actually they're not. Right? We should be looking at wage and pension freezes for the bureaucracy. I mean, they're just unbelievably, gone wild with the salary increases for the bureaucracy. But that's a separate matter. Let's take them as non-discretionary. That leaves 40% of the budget, which is discretionary. And there, the finance minister has not bothered to tell us that non-interest current expenditure under his watch has gone up 20%. I mean, it's ridiculous. And where is it going? Pork barrel projects, political bribes, political largesse, and completely unjustified and unwarranted expenditures.
Now, that's the important point. I've just documented recently, I think today it was in the papers by one of my people. The government has made 65 new agencies in this fiscal year, the last fiscal year. There are a huge number of new agencies that are coming up. And the planning, the PSTP, has now gone up to 1 trillion rupees. And the provincial PSTPs have gone up by much more. So we've got a 4.5 trillion PSTP across the country. And PSTP, as you know, is a list of pork barrels, so I don't think it's doing very well. And PSTP also, we've seen lots of work that we've done I wrote a book on this long time ago, I think 2017, 18 or something, that PSTP has no relationship with growth. My people, Muslim Ijaz Ghani also did something. A couple of other people have done it too. PSTP has no relationship with growth in the sense that it doesn't catalyze private sector investment. It doesn't catalyze growth. So quite frankly, the PSTP system needs reform. So the question is, I would put to you, right, if the government had not created those agencies, which we never know why they create an agency. There's no white paper or anything that tells you why they create an agency. And if the government didn't push up the PSTP, we could have probably shot down our debt by a couple of trillion rupees. And we don't believe in reducing our debt. And then we complain debt servicing has gone up, so we need more revenues. So I think that's one thing. But then I'll push back on this thing that the informal sector. I'm a great fan of the informal sector. I think let it grow. They're keeping us alive, right? Secondly, I've looked at something which I'm sure you've seen. I call our industry sunset industry. State-led, unlisted, non-professional companies and pygmy companies. They don't grow at all. For example, take simple companies like MCB, $800 million. Habib Bank, $1.2 billion. But these are not serious companies in the world. Serious companies in the world are double-digit billions or maybe more. Question is, why have Pakistan not produced one single company? When we did a survey of the engineering industry around the country. And one question we asked them, why don't you grow? All of them said, I want to stay under the radar. I don't want FPR to know me. So if you're operating in this environment, then the question is we have to make up our minds. And this is where I part company with you and FEs. And look, we need to focus on corporate growth. Investment is 8% of GDP, private sector. Nobody wants to focus on investment, yet we cite tax GDP ratio must be 10. Okay, what do I want? I want investment to be 25% of GDP. I don't care whether tax GDP ratio goes up or not. I want investment to be 25. And if tax GDP ratio is interfering with investment, I'll sacrifice that. How do you react to that?
I fully agree. Because your end objective and mine is exactly the same. Because what will get us growth is productive investment. And right now, what are fiscal framework, what are policies, whether it be the tax policy or the fiscal policy generally, what is it incentivizing? Look at the incentives this budget is giving you. Trade, not manufacture. Don't invest in the productive real sector. Invest in real estate and stock market. You get lower tax rates. You'll get tax breaks. Emigrate if you're a salaried individual in Pakistan. If you have the opportunity, leave the country. If you have the opportunity, don't invest in Pakistan at all. Just look for capital flight opportunities. So it's just ridiculous. You will never get growth under these circumstances. And here's another thing with the IMF program. Something I just worked out and is going to be part of my next sort of op-ed. So look at what the IMF is doing with its austerity policy, and we've accepted. So obviously, it's not just it takes two to tango. So I don't blame the IMF alone. I blame our own policymakers for not conceptualizing and visualizing and pushing back and saying, look, this is completely wrong. So the IMF, or maybe let's say the Troika, in the case of Greece, maybe the IMF less so, has put Greece on a path of fiscal austerity to 2060. Do you know they're mandated to throw up primary surpluses till 2060 because of all the bailouts they've taken, which have actually gone to pay off German banks, and the Greece are left holding the baby. Now, with $330 billion of debt, they're saying, the IMF is saying, the only way to pay this back is throw up a primary surplus till 2060. This is ridiculous. This is exactly the kind of framework they're imposing on us. Because if you look at a growth rate of 3%, roundabout, it's ridiculous that we get anything with a debt overhang of anything at over than 3%. Even that is going to be, 3% is going to be agriculture driven at most. Now, 3% real GDP growth rate, roughly a 7% real interest rate that you have currently. Under the standard debt equation, that gives you, you need to throw up for the next 5 years, in the case of Pakistan, a primary surplus of 2.3% of GDP each year. I mean, that's ridiculous. Where do you get growth under that circumstances? What kind of investment are you talking about? So the incentives you're giving are, and to be honest, what you said about the private sector in Pakistan, That's fine. I fully agree about they being overly protected, and as you've said many times in the past, they're 75-year-old infants, etc., etc. However, there's always a second part to the picture, and I think it's important for us to say that, because I'm not completely enamored with this creative destruction philosophy which is in place, because I'm saying, look, when the private sector is operating completely with its own agency and is producing these outcomes of being low productivity, low investment, high profitability behind big tariff protection, etc., then creative destruction makes a lot of sense. But when you are operating under an environment where the government is not providing you macroeconomic stability, it's not providing you political stability, it's not providing you water, it's not providing you electricity, either affordable electricity or even availability of electricity. It doesn't provide you gas for 4 months of the year, and it's completely fine with that. It doesn't provide you protection against smuggling and misdeclaration of goods into Pakistan. It doesn't provide you protection against the informal sector, which doesn't have to pay 27 to 29% of the taxes you're paying. Then talking about creative destruction, I think, is a bit rich. First, fix all these things, right? Let's consider that the private sector is operating with huge impediments and hurdles as well. And I'm really amazed that we have $35 billion of exports, to be honest. Under these circumstances, I would expect exports to be close to zero.
No, fair point. But look, let's. I mean, I take your point. All the items that you listed, from gas to whatever, these all fall under the purview of public sector provision of services. Now, people like me would say, why the hell is the government in the gas sector? Why the hell is the government in the energy sector or the water sector? Why can't we just outsource these services and live like a decent market economy? My question to you is very simple. What I've noted is that there are no markets in Pakistan. In fact, the much reviled real estate, there is no real estate market. It's a market honored by some brokers and some states, but there is no real estate market where you and I can operate. And I've tried it personally. I've gone out looking for plots and houses, etc. And honestly, I can't even get the information. I don't even know where to begin. And the moment I think about getting into a property, I've done this in many countries, as you know. I've been overseas for 30, 40 years of my life. So I've done this in the US, I've done it in the UK. And I know how easy it is to buy a property. You can get all the information. You can get the comparable. You can get the past property prices, etc. You can make your projection, make a bid. Here, you can't do that. Here, you're flying in the dark. And you get a bloody broker who comes and tells you, and most often he's a front man of somebody else. So you get dropped. In the West, for example, when your parent dies or something, you can sell your property very easily. Here, for example, I know people who have trying to sell their properties for the last 10 years. They can't sell anything because, again, the market is not organized. So the question is that why does the government, and most of our economists are anti-market. They don't like markets. And our tax policy is anti-market. For example, more recently, they've said, even if I have to buy a 5 crore property, and this is the device, first is 1 crore, I have to get an FBR permission. Now, please tell me, first of all, there's no property under 5 crore. Everything is above 5 crore. So FBR will be giving permissions to everybody. And obviously, when I get a permission, I'll have to pay them 5-10 lakh rupees to get the permission. Now, this kind of nonsense that is going on in the country, we calculated, I don't know whether you saw Sludge series or not. I did this series when I was in the pipe. And I noticed that, if I wanted to set up a restaurant, there were about 20 permissions, NOCs, inspectors will come there. And most people kind of give up doing business after that. I know many people who've given up and said, yeah, I can't operate here because there's just too much going on. So then if your business grows a little, you have to become a tax collection service because you have to get value-added tax. And then you have to give it to the FPR and FPR doesn't refund you. So, I mean, there's a huge issues there. All of them relate to one thing, the role of the government. So tell me, where do you see yourself or our economists? Speak generally for the economists too. Because I think our economists are too confused about the role of the government. Where should the government be? Why should the government be giving us energy? For example, a long time ago, it was decided that there would be an energy market. When wheeling is available and we have a system worked out, why can't we start the energy market? Who doesn't want the energy market to start? At the same time, you think of any market that we can, wheat, sugar, all these things controlled by the government, with the result and the government messes up and then it wants to collect more taxes. How do you see that?
Look, I think partially we are on the same page because obviously, we would all like to see the footprint of the government or the state to be smaller, especially vis-a-vis the economy. And we're heading in the wrong direction. And unfortunately, the flag is now being held by the non-civilian side. They're marching into other areas of the economy that instead of rolling back, they're doing the Egyptian model in many senses. So this is actually even worse, and nobody talks about this, and I think we need to talk about that. But let's put that under this framework as well, because they're part of the state, obviously, and we need to see a rollback of the state. But having said that, I still think I'm from the camp that believes that their minimum level of provision of public services, that is the domain, public goods, which the government has to provide. Be it an educated labor force, be it electricity. Ultimately, yes, we need private markets in the electricity. But to be honest, I think we're in a hybrid state there as well, just like our political systems, where we were supposed to unbundle WAPDA and get rid of that and move into a private market, and we're in a halfway sort of house where we've got private generators who are really not private.
Oops. What happened? Did you press the mute button?
Generators, because they're operating,
Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
So, it's a weird halfway house that we've created. So, and I fully agree with you about the markets in other areas like sugar and the commodities. Now, so it's obvious why there are vested interests who want this kind of hold. Now, you spoke about FBR and CDA. So let me tell you, it's really funny. I live in a high-rise apartment block here in Islamabad. One of my neighbors is the CDA chap who was supposed to give the developers the completion certificate. He didn't pay for his apartment, right? He got that in lieu of the completion certificate, right? Another of my neighbor, and this is one of the most expensive apartment blocks in Islamabad, right? Another of my neighbors is an ex-chairman FBR. Another one is an ex-member FBR. So, I mean, it's just, what the game is, right? So we have to break this game, but nobody's interested. And now we've got a new player marching in uniform and, taking over even more commanding heights of the economy, and rolling them back is going to be even more difficult.
But everybody is on the same page. SIFC claims it wants to increase exports, it wants to increase investments. IMF says growth will increase, but it gives us nothing. It just says that growth will increase. But we've seen 25 IMF programs. 75 years of IMF, each program lasts 3 to 5 years. So you can imagine we've never been out of an IMF program. I think we're the only country that has never made independent policy, always made through the IMF program. But yet we all want the same thing. We all want to grow. We all want better lives. We all want better goods. We all want to buy sleek cars and have fancy houses, etc., etc. But yet we don't seem to understand. And partly I blame the economists. Partly I blame us. We have not explained to people how to get things going. We focus on the tax GDP ratio, and we focus, like the IMF and the World Bank, on simply the external sector and don't talk about the domestic sector. And structural reform, to me, has become a word now that's, I think, is so overused and so meaningless that when we use structural reform, everybody falls asleep. What do you think structural reform means? What is your idea of a structural reform?
I think that's a great question and a great observation as well, because it's so overused now that it really means nothing unless you flesh it out and explain it. And I've tried to explain this. For me, actually, the starting point is because you mentioned the lack of markets in Pakistan. And one of the things is, for markets to function, you need an institutional framework. So really, for me, the biggest thing, even beyond structural reform, so when we say tax to GDP and we say, exports to GDP or whatever, really the starting point for me is an institutional framework which supports the functioning of markets, right? So that provides a market infrastructure as well. And that would include also, for me, where there's political legitimacy for governments that make decisions. Because I think a lot of things flow from that. So right now, what we're seeing, for example, is coming back to an austerity example. It's really easy for this government to impose austerity on us. As one commentator said, austerity for the many and privileges for the few, or something to that extent. They can get away with it because they're not rooted in political legitimacy. But a government that would be rooted in it would be a politically representative government, would then actually have more pressure on it to structure it in such a way where the burden of adjustment is more on the groups that are more able to pay and able to escape the effects so far. So I think that's an important point. The other thing is this whole thing that we talk about, this discretionary power with FPR or with CDA or with the bureaucracy generally, both the civilian and the non-civilian bureaucracy, that's also part of it. Obviously, they're a big roadblock in creating a functioning market economy, right? So I think that's where, when I talk about structural reforms, I'm actually talking more about institutional reform. The structural reform then comes as a corollary to that.
Very good point. In fact, you're in good company because, as you know, Acemoglu won the Nobel Prize, North won the Nobel Prize. Most economic Nobel Prizes has gone in the last 20, 30 years. My classmate Paul Romer won the Nobel Prize, Robert Lucas, my professor, won the Nobel Prize. And all of them had the same theme, that growth comes from institutional reform that unlocks ideas. As Paul Romer says, it is the object gap is not important for developing countries. It is the idea gap that is important. And the thing is that you have to develop institutions to make ideas happen. But there, we got a tough problem. Let me step back. I wrote a Substack article recently, you might have seen it, that markets are like the Olympic Games. I mean, when you talk about tennis or athletics or, whatever, there's a market. And that marketplace means that players like Arshad, Nadeem, etc. are going to contest. And what you have to decide is merit. How to decide merit? You have to lay out the rules properly, and you have to make sure that the umpiring is clever and proper. So in all cases, you have to hire professionals from that area. I can't write the rules for javelin, but a javelin thrower can write the rules for javelin. New games have been introduced, skateboarding. I can't write the rules for skateboarding. A skateboarder has to write the rules and umpire the skateboard. Now here we've got one person or several people who passed Lord Macaulay's exam, and they are capable of regulating everything. We've got 122, and the second thing is the World Bank keeps coming to us in international agencies. They keep creating new agencies. For example, we've got 122 regulations, most of them created by international donors in Islamabad, more outside. We've got 140 training institutions in Islamabad, right? More outside. These are created by the World Bank. We've got the Competition Council created by the World Bank. We've got NEPRA created by the World Bank. We've got now the Mortgage Refinance Corporation created by the World Bank. They're all staffed by the same people. They're not staffed by specialists, right? How can we create markets in this setup? And all the regulators want to do is collect a fee. So that we don't actually tax GDP ratio. For example, NEPRA collects a huge amount of fees, PEMRA collects a huge amount of fees, all these things are collecting a huge amount of fees. But that is not counted to the tax GDP ratio, but it goes to the budget. So the question is, or it's kept by them, how can we have markets in this milieu where there are no experts? The energy people don't know energy, the civil servant is in charge of energy, the stock market people don't know the stock market, the civil service. So what do we do?
I think that's a great question and a great dilemma, because under these circumstances, clearly, the mess that we're in is quite revealing. I mean, it points to certain malaise of the way of a governance model, which is completely toxic. Right, so it's not just right at the beginning, right at the top. I mean, you talk about geopolitical rents or trying to extract those. That's a toxic governance model right at the top. But when you come lower down, maybe second tier or third tier or whatever, there you have this model where the bureaucrats just don't go away. Like you've said, I mean, they retire technically, and then they find parking spots as regulators, and they start, and they're complete generalists, right? So we have a problem where technocrats or specialists are working under these. So we had a chief statistician, not the current one. I mean, he's a great guy. Finally, we do have an expert and a technocrat, which is a great thing. But the previous one was, he was Special Secretary Finance, and before that, he was DC in Punjab. So you're absolutely right. Under these conditions, we're not going anywhere. We're just going to be spinning the wheels. And when you spin wheels, you're obviously creating a bigger ditch underneath you.
Now, let me take you back to your position as advisor to the Ministry of Finance, an important position where you were sitting in many important meetings, negotiations, etc., fund program, etc., and you've seen a lot of stuff. Let's go back and look at the fund program, for example. I mean, I hear this all the time, and I'm a bit surprised when the finance minister turns around and says, I can't do this because the fund program won't allow me to do it. I've worked in many countries with the fund. And I remember ministers who would say, hey, this is my program. I am going to go further than you. Remember Václav Klaus, for example, in Czech Republic, said, hey, this is my program. I'm going to go further than the fund. Fund is saying, oh, stop here. I'm not going to stop here. I'm going to do better than the fund. Right? So Manmohan Singh, for example, said, hey, I'm going to pursue my own program. I'm going to return the fund program. I'm going to stop the fund program, but I'm going to do a deeper reform. Mahathir, who said, hey, I don't want a fund program because I want to do a deeper reform than the fund. So you think about that and tell me, at your time, how did we negotiate with the fund, and how did your experience go in the ministry? Was it a positive experience? Where were the stumbling blocks? Let's put it that way.
So I think because you obviously sort of interacted with us, and so you know the story. I think the program that I was involved in from 2008, the standby arrangement from 2008 to it was a 3 years SBA, was actually quite unique, was quite different. And I think it's an outlier by many standards.
Oops.
Not because we did well. That was, as you remember, we were transiting from, sort of a military government to a supposedly civilian government. And the US wanted to support the transition, right? So they gave the IMF a free hand. Initially, the political government of the day asked for bilateral assistance, a huge amount of bilateral assistance. But the message that they got from the US was that no bilateral assistance, everything is going to be done through multilateral institutions, and the IMF is going to lead the way. Right, so so remember, we were quite surprised because our requirement, what we asked for, was something like, I mean, I forget the quota in terms of quota. I think it was 125% of quota that we had asked for, and we got something like twice that. It was completely, just bogged us, completely gobsmacked us. Normally you ask the IMF for something higher and you get something lower, right? And this was completely reversed. And not just that, from what I remember, and I could be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this was the first time ever that there was a component, and a fairly large component, which was not just for BOP support. It was actually for budget support, which is really unusual for the IMF to structure it this way. Right, so clearly they were going out of the way. And the third way they went out of the way was that, they had that standard list of performative actions, etc. And we had people like Dr. Tisham with us, etc. Obviously, you knew the IMF, had worked with them, and he was very respected. And he pushed back and he said, look, he told the finance minister, he said, this is a great opportunity for you to actually do some fundamental reform in Pakistan, especially on the tax side, and even on the expenditure side, with the treasury single account, etc., and just lay it on the IMF. But we internally will tell the IMF to push back, just push off, give us the space, let us design the program ourselves. So that's what I'm saying. It was, I think, a complete outlier. Probably the only time I can recall where, for example, and then we had a really supportive mission chief as well, Adnan Mazirai, I'm sure you remember. Adnan was really helpful. He said, Yeah. So he really wanted to help the country, and he really wanted to be supportive, because I think he saw the other side was, quite interested in doing something, leaving a legacy of reform, etc. So they gave us a lot of leeway. And I think we didn't succeed. Let's be honest. We didn't succeed because our flagship thing that we put on the table was the VAT, the value added tax. We told them, look, don't give us quarterly targets for revenue, etc. We'll meet your overall fiscal deficit in a certain way. We'll do it our way. But what we'll bring to the table, and at the end of 3 years, will be a value added tax in Pakistan, an integrated value added tax which combines goods and services. And I think this was overly ambitious, because really you need to do a lot of groundwork. And this is something this wasn't my field. Obviously, the specialists were running with this. But now that I've read up a bit more about it and looked at it, I thought this was really over ambitious. We couldn't have delivered this, because it takes a lot of groundwork to introduce a VAT, as you know. Especially to make sure that FBR is up to the mark in terms of processing the input adjustments and the refunds, etc. And they're certainly not there, and they don't want to be there. And then the businessmen saw through the VAT, because the VAT was not a revenue generation exercise. It was a Trojan horse for documentation. That's what we wanted to insert into the economy, a Trojan horse for documentation, and they saw through that. So they fought back. And we weren't prepared for that, that whole long-term sort of fight, etc. So I think the conditions are really conducive to do something, but unfortunately, I think we missed the boat, or maybe the window was too small and narrow to do what we wanted to do.
Fair point. No, I take that point of view, and I saw the demise of the VAT when I was there. Everybody gamed us, the tax service, the parliament. They took us up to the parliament and gamed us with the parliament and got rid of it. And the question is all political economy issues, and these are deep reform issues that unfortunately technocrats can't solve. And maybe we can design these things, but you require, as I use my example and people hate me for it, you require a Pinochet with Chicago boys to do it. Chicago boys design the reform, Pinochet hammers them through. So you have that kind of thing to do the reform. But unfortunately, we don't have that in Pakistan. But
Nadeem, I'll stop you there. Sorry, I have to say, because obviously with your Chicago background, Pinochet maybe the poster boy for you. For me, it's like, people like P.V. Narasimha Rao.
What about Millet?
He gave Bontek Singh Ahluwalia. He was an elected politician, not an US installed or CIA installed politician or person. And he got Bontek Singh Ahluwalia and Manmohan Singh to do the reforms in India. So that's the model that we need.
I accept that. But I think we also have to have room for an Elon Musk, a bull in a China shop to come and destroy USAID. I think there's the best thing that happened. USAID destroyed, and only Elon Musk could do it. No bureaucrat, no politician could have done it. But anyway, let's leave that aside. It's a great debate. We must have it sometime else. But let me ask you another question. Supposing now you were designing the 25th IMF program, which is coming. Sorry, let me step you back a little. I hope you heard what Ken Rogoff said about Pakistan, the Tyler Coben. Did you hear it?
Yes.
So what do you think of that first? Do you think Ken Rogoff is right, or do you think he's wrong?
Sorry, you're talking about Kenneth Rogoff?
Yeah. He said something on a Tyler Coben show. Let me repeat it for you, and I'm sure you've heard it. He said, when Tyler Coben asked him pointedly, what would you do about Pakistan? He said, can't do anything about Pakistan. Pakistan is in a deep institutional mess. It's never going to come out. So when Kenneth asked him, hey, what are you going to do about the next program? He said, I'll have to give it. So he said, if you were the fund MD, what would you do? So Ken says, I will give them the IMF program. In fact, we should stop this charade that we're giving them IMF program. We should just regard it as aid. It's not a lot of money. It's of almost $1 billion a year, maybe $2 billion a year. Not a lot of money. But Pakistan is never going to get out of the debt trap. So Tyler again asked him, said, hey, what if, Pakistan has to get out of it? He said, no. If you don't give them the fund program, they'll default. So let them continue like this. So he expressed extreme pessimism on Pakistan getting out of this mess. Now, how would you react to that?
So I think that's a really important point. I mean, I actually heard his thing with Ezra Klein on the dollar decline. So I didn't hear this on the Pakistan specifically.
No, this is Tyler Cohen. Look, check it out.
Okay, I will. Thanks. No, but I think he's absolutely right. Except what I don't agree with, and what we've tried to put on the table for the only way out of this austerity program is I think the IMF has to bring debt restructuring onto the table. This is exactly what they pushed for in Greece, surprisingly. I mean, Yanis Varoufakis, for all his, criticism of the IMF, the fact is that the IMF actually was the one that brought up the debt rescheduling for Greece and said that Greece will never come out of this unless we do a debt write-off for Greece. And then after the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, Christine Lagarde was once again in the lead, in saying that we need to think about debt write-off for all these developing countries that are now, so debt-laden, there's nothing they can do. However, having said that, surprisingly for countries like Pakistan, the IMF still insists on austerity policies, and they're going to continue well into, if we don't push back and we don't find a via media, we're going to, like I said, we're going to be loped with this austerity policy, which is not going to produce growth, is going to produce even more poverty and unemployment than currently, and more impoverishment of the middle class in Pakistan, just like in Greece, for years and years, maybe 5 to 7 years, maybe up to 10 years. So we have to bring a debt rescheduling or a debt write-off to the table. I know there's a moral hazard associated with a country like Pakistan seeking, getting a debt write-off because we're incorrigible, right? But I think maybe we need to bring the people of Pakistan into the picture as well, and lighten their burden. And then the other thing, which is, I think the IMF really, has to be hauled over the coals. And in fact, they've stopped talking to me now because I've been sort of getting under the skin now with this whole thing. That how come you gave this government a clean pass for the last 2-3 years on their current expenditures and their political bribes, and you're extracting that from the people of Pakistan from austerity policies, right? So we have to put them on the coal, and we have to haul them over the coals, and we have to say, even to our policymakers, why have you taken debt rescheduling off the table? It doesn't make sense. Pakistan has to bring this onto the table, and then have a program where then there's a much more responsible fiscal framework where we are taxing political constituents of the government or the regime generally, and cutting back on expenditures that go to them. That's the only way to do it.
Let me push back a little. I love to argue, so allow me to push back a little. We had a rescheduling in 2003.
Yes.
And we wasted it. And by 2003, after the rescheduling in 2006 program, in 2008, we were back in a mess. 2008, we were back in a program. Then we had many more programs. 2017, we declared victory. Remember, we declared victory after Dar Sahib, and you said, now we've kissed goodbye to the fund, etc. I think 2016 or 17, whenever it was the last program. In 2017, the rupee devalued by God knows how many percent, right? So we've had this thing. So while you're saying rescheduling, our bureaucracy, and I remember when I was in the planning commission, our bureaucrats would say, let's commit to the fund. We know we don't mean it. We'll just commit to the fund. We won't do it. So, I mean, there's this huge moral hazard problem there. So I don't know whether I'm for institutional reform or not, but let me take it another direction. I think apart from rescheduling, there's another path out. What about growth? Why can't we just go for growth? How difficult would it be for us to go for growth? Let's say 7%, 8%. I'll tell you my instruments. My instrument would be a sharp rescheduling. Sharp deregulation. Sharp deregulation. Open the economy and tell these guys, look, bureaucrats, forget it. You are not licensing anything. You are not giving NOCs. NOC is something that I would ban instantaneously. NOC, I don't know what it means. NOC, I don't think anywhere else in the world is there an NOC except here, right? And I would ban these inspectors and these stupidities that we have, zoning regulations, and et cetera, et cetera. Many things I would ban. The input-output coefficient in the bloody FPR. And the FPR documentation drive. We can document when we grow. Why do we have to document before we grow? I mean, I'm sure, Sakib, you've read this. It's my story from my time, but maybe you've read it too. The hundreds of films made on it. Robin Hood. The sheriff of Nottingham would tax everything under the sun, and he would kill the economy until Robin Hood came along and rebelled, and he started stealing from the sheriff. So this is an old parable on taxation. Now we've got a sheriff of Nottingham economy. I counted just today the number of taxes on my electricity bill are 13. How the hell do you have, what theory of taxation tells you to have 13 bills, 13 taxes on one service? I mean, this ridiculous system has to go. So what if we do with this? So what if you have a fiscal deficit of 7-8% of GDP? So what if you have a growth, inflation of 12-13% of GDP, provided we grow at 7-8%? Is that not a solution? How would you deal with that?
I think that would be a great solution, and I fully agree with it. But there's an elephant in the room you've skirted around. It's not the fiscal deficit. To be honest, I'm really less worried about the fiscal deficit and even inflation. If it's not really crazily out of the roof, so 10 to 12%, 15% is fine as long as you have growth along with that. The elephant in the room is the balance of payments constraint.
Okay.
That is really what's hobbling us. Something we've not paid attention to for the last 40 years. It's just ridiculous. So if somehow we can get foreign direct investment in, and that releases that constraint, then that growth is fine. That model would work. But without that, I don't think it will work.
No, hang on. Let's take that into account. Foreign direct investment. I know SIFC is looking for it. Everybody's looking for it. But the foreign investor tells me, and you know the foreign investors, they have 10 times better economists than you and me out there. They've got a huge amount of, they have far more information than we have, right? They've got better economists than the IMF. Those guys are serious investors. They know the world. They know the game, the way it works. Now, those guys look at us and they say, guys, you have no private investment here. Mm-hmm. Why should we come to a country where there's no private investment? You have no market here. Why do I come to a country where there's no market? You have no bankruptcy laws here. Why do I come to a country where I can't even declare bankruptcy? Why do I want to put my head in the lion's den where the FDR investor will come to me every day and demand a flat or demand this, So, I mean, they also go to countries. They know the countries well. I mean, as I told you, they have better people than us to judge a country. They come here for 2 days and they know the country very well. And Reuters has reports and so many people have reports. They read them. So I think foreign investment is not going to work. But I take your point in the BOP. Now, everybody says to me that there is a BOP problem. I just wrote an article the other day, I don't know if you saw it, and I've written a paper on it before, that all the BOP crises were caused by the central bank. We want to fix the exchange rate. That's the BOP problem. If we want to fix the exchange rate, like right now, I don't know whether you agree with me or not, but tell me. I think we fixed the exchange rate. I think our exchange rate is overvalued. I think that we are tightening the noose on LCs. People are crying. I went to the market here. I wanted to buy $1,000 because I was going out of the country. I couldn't get $1,000. There's a huge supply constraint. Now, my friend Ashfaq, you know very well. I take Ashfaq on this program too all the time. Now, Ashfaq says, no, please, don't devalue the exchange rate. Some people like Ashfaq Dar say take the exchange rate to 2040. I think we are most confused. What is your view of the exchange rate? And would the exchange rate not solve our balance of payments problem?
Okay, first, let me just take you back maybe, 27 years or whatever. Our first meeting, I don't know if you remember, but you, Dr. Mushtaq, and I met, and we had this discussion on the exchange rate. And my view was completely different. I was like, I was like more like Dr. Ashfaq then. And now for the last maybe 15 years, I've actually seen the light. And I really believe that our exchange rate is another albatross that we've hung around our neck. The economy. The fact that the export sector is only 8% of the entire economy is a large function of not just the tax side, but the exchange rate side. And I think there's something I came across from the State Bank, which said that and this was in 2018, right? So, I mean, this probably continues obviously now and is equally valid for 2025. But in 2018, their study said that for 67 of the last years since independence, Pakistan has an overvalued exchange rate. I don't think there would be any other country, with that kind of. So I mean, clearly we've told our exporters we prefer the imports, right? We want you to subsidize the importers, and there's no surprise that we ended up with a 8% export to GDP ratio. So, and coming back to today, you're absolutely right. With all the the exchange rate restrictions, the capital controls in place, we have an overvalued exchange rate today. And this is one pathway to growth. But the thing is that it will take time. Obviously, there's an adjustment period and adjustment cost, which is fine. We should take that. I fully agree. But I think there'll be, if there's a surge in imports and there's a delay in the export response, then you need to figure out how to, bridge that balance of payments problem.
But Sakib, I learned in Economics 101 that the best mechanism to take that into account is the exchange rate. Let the exchange rate adjust, right? Exchange rate is what they call it a switching regime. You switch from imports to exports or vice versa, depending on the exchange rate. Now, when I looked at it, for example, I documented it a long time ago. First of all, we documented this when I was in the PhD paper on this. We did a huge survey of all the exchange rate regimes, not exchange rate regime, but there's a huge amount of literature there on the exchange rate regime and growth. And we found that undervaluation is very important for growth.
Yes.
And we found a large number of countries, East Asia, etc., Brazil, etc., followed a policy of undervaluation where they felt that this is the way to move forward, right? Now, unfortunately, we followed the path of overvaluation, right? Now, if you think about it, people keep telling me there's a balance of payment cycle. But I've noticed, for example, when I was in the third year of my LSE program, the exchange rate jumped from 5 to 11. I mean, overnight. And my fee shot up by 100%, right? So I suffered there. Then if you think about it, in 1998, we created a Ponzi scheme. The State Bank created a Ponzi scheme, and I took part in it, where they said, okay, bring back your dollars, put them in FCDs, and you can take a loan against them. And we did that, and the exchange rate was protected, and I did well for about 5-10 years. And then we had a crash, and then we came down from overnight from 46 to 64, along with the governor arguing for a default on the payment loans. And I remember talking to the IMF people when I was there, and we got that default blocked. But we actually talked about a default on the local FCD holdings. Then if you see 2008, we kept the exchange rate fixed to 60 for 6-7 years. And then we had a crash. And if you recall, the exchange rate was 60 to 90 almost overnight, over a period of a week or so. And then we come to 20, we held the exchange rate about 100, held it constant. Then it went from 100 to 180, then to 340 or something. And then we brought it back to 280 and held it there. And now I think we are heading towards another possible event. I call it an event, not anything, adverse. Question is, if we did not do this, if the central bank, and in each episode, the central bank spent real dollars, reserves, to defend the rate. I do another calculation. If you go back and say the central bank had not done that and accumulated the reserves, right, and allowed the exchange rate to depreciate steadily. Today, the state bank might have had $50 billion, and the exchange rate would probably be in the same place. So I think this confusion about the exchange rate that we have, even amongst economists, this is the serious confusion. If we let the exchange rate go, I know there's going to be an inflation impact. Yes, also calculated the pass-through. The pass-through is about 30-40%, so it's not small. And maybe even larger because it was secondary effects too. So yes, there's a pass-through effect too. But then the whole problem lies on the monetary side. The monetary side doesn't seem to understand either interest rate or exchange rate, right? And the fiscal policy doesn't seem to understand taxation. So my last question to you is, I think economics has failed in this country. Would you agree? Economics is the subject. Economic policy advisors have failed. Although we really haven't, as I began the segment, we've had no economists in the country that we actually recognized. We mostly have bankers who act as economists. So is there a fundamental problem? And in the government, did you see any economic research for people capable of understanding these issues and discussing them? Did you ever debate these questions when you were in the finance ministry?
Yeah, so obviously there was a very small sort of circle then of I was really sort of lucky that I got to interact with people like Dr. Ihtisham as well, who sort of understood these things, because the other economists, to be honest, I mean,
But to be fair, Ihtisham, as you know, is a very good friend of mine. Ihtisham has never been in Pakistan. And he regrets having been there then. Every time I talk to him, he says, forget it. That's the worst thing I ever did in my life.
Exactly. No, but what I meant was that, because the other economists who are really heavyweights, I really sort of value my interaction with them as well. You know who I'm talking about, but I don't want to mention them. But their thinking is really sort of, you're absolutely right. I think in many senses shackled the debate around the exchange rate in Pakistan. I really, on that particular point, I fully agree with you, because our politicians, our business community, our industrialists have actually taken a cue from what these heavyweight economists have been saying in Pakistan, and they've been completely wrong about the exchange rate. And even now, I'm surprised that they're not willing to, learn or be flexible about their position, because now the damage the exchange rate, the overvalued exchange rate policy has done to Pakistan is so obvious that you can't defend it anymore, right? And there's still, so I think in many senses, you're right. But now the silver lining that I see, and I'm sure you see this more because, you've done, hats off to you. You did a great job at PIDE, for example, in initiating this debate. But you saw probably a lot more young economists in Pakistan, and I've seen many as well, who've studied from abroad, who've come back, or even those who've studied here. I actually think they're a really great bunch of people. Somehow, one of my suggestions a few years was to group them into the policy debate. Somehow. So when, for example, even this government surprisingly asked me to be on the Economic Advisory Council, I refused. Because they don't need people like me. They don't need the usual suspects. I think they should just wipe us off the table, even though I'm not the old heavyweight. But they should just introduce some of these good new guys. I think they're fantastic. They're really up to the mark, and you've done a great job with many of them as well in developing them. So I think we should put these guys into the picture.
Okay, I said last question, but I still have one more question. In fact, many more questions. Just shortage of time that I want to close. But I think it's a great debate, and we should have more of these. Inshallah, we'll do more. Very quickly, tell me, I want to talk about process more than anything else. Now, you were a part of the finance ministry process. You used to write the economic survey. You had control of the economic advisors wing, which is where most of the Ministry of Finance research and analysis and overall economy is done. Just quickly tell us, what do you think of the budget making process, A, and B, of how the Ministry of Finance thinks? And related to that, you also related to the Planning Commission. I used to be there, but anyway, it doesn't matter. Do you think this is a debate that's going on forever, but it needs some kind of analysis? What is the role of the Planning Commission now? Should it be there? Or in particular, PSTP? What do you think of the PSTP? Should it be restructured? This has been going on 70 years. I think some things should be restructured. So just your thoughts on these things.
So in my framework, the ideal situation is, when I came to the Ministry of Finance, and this is not apocryphal, this is actual, I'm not giving you, so when we came into the Q block, there's a weighbridge between Q block and, the way that Secretariat was designed was very sensible to design, right? So you could walk from Q block into P block, where the Planning Commission is. But when I came into the Ministry of Finance, there were not one but two big padlocks. For some reason, somebody thought that we should block the way from Q block to P block. Yeah, it just doesn't make sense, right? So we got it opened, and nobody was interested to talk to each other. And really, in my view, I still think there needs to be a planning commission. Obviously, it needs to be more of a think tank. And it needs to be more evolved in what it does. It shouldn't be the arbiter or the custodian of the PSTP. But when I came, once again, it's really bizarre. How we were functioning like we were in 1870s, because the budget was in the hand of this one guy who wasn't even a section officer, right? And you know who it was, right? So even the minister used to say, "Yeah, what's the actual number?" And we all used to go into the basement to look for that guy, and that guy used to dig up those files with those nadas and used to say, the actual number actually of the deficit is this. But we're reporting this to the IMF, and this is what we're reporting to Parliament, right? So there were three sets of books and whatever. And in the Planning Commission, the guy who used to run the PSTP was just one guy. who was dealing with the contractor mafia, who was dealing with the politicians, right? And he was the point man for all the, sort of how to the PSTP was being structured, the book barrel project, etc., etc. So really, I'm sure it's evolved. I mean, the Ministry of Finance has evolved. I don't know about the budget making process, but I can tell you about the economic advisors wing. I'm really impressed, to be honest, with one of my successors, done a fabulous job. Now he's become the chief economist, Dr. Imtiaz, did a great job. He introduced a lot of economic analysis and the proper kind of analysis, and they work with I forget who, EU or somebody. So they have proper models now, macroeconomic models. They've set up a macro fiscal unit now. I hope and they've hired a great person for that as well. So it's completely different, much more evolved than when I was there. So at least that part of it seems to be working in the right direction. But whether that input goes into anything or any policy, that's a separate matter.
What about the budget making process in the ECC?
I mean, the ECC, you've written about this for many years. Your critique is absolutely spot on. The ECC is a transactional body. It's there basically to accommodate political interests, vested interests, nothing else. And as you've said, rightly pointed out many years ago, the first ECC meeting after the budget means that the budget is being undermined, right? It completely bypasses the budget process, and it starts working on a supplementary budget, supplementary expenditures. So it's a completely it's a construct which is meant to accommodate vested interests, and the budget making process is not. To my understanding, I could be completely wrong. I'm not really I haven't visited Q Block for quite a while, so I really don't know. I'm not too welcome there now as well. But my sense is it's not changed too much. The Economic Advisors Wing has moved on and it's done a great job. But the budget making process, the PSTP seems to be stuck in the same, rear view mirror that it was in the past.
Now, I mean, we'll close here, but I'll just leave this thought with you that I hope the IMF looks into this. I think we need a good budget making process. We also need to think about the BSTP. For example, should we even have a separation of current investment expenditures? Or as I argued in my framework of economic growth, that we should move to more of a performance-based system. Because BSTP is an input-based system. We only count how much money is being spent on a project. We never worry about whether the project yielded anything. For example, case in point, these flyovers or these bypasses, etc. Do they yield any revenue? Are they just, whatever? Or, for example, the number of universities we've created. So I think next time I'd like to take you deeper into these processes and try and understand. And maybe we'll bring some other people who know something about this. Because I think it's time that we talked about these processes, where things get done and how do they get done and how does information flow? Because the key thing that I learned from Hayek is that it's information flows that determine decisions. Decisions not taken in a vacuum. Information flows that determine decisions. What are the information flows? Where are the information? If the section officer creates a flow, and then it goes up and down, and we don't know what's happened. There's no research involved. There's no, for example, cost benefit done in the PSTP. Or should the PSTP be there? Or should we give the development budget to the
Nadeem, sorry, let me, because this is a really important point. I'm sorry, I'm interjecting, but this is a really important point about information flows affecting decisions. Because you've seen in the past, our sugar policy is driven by deliberately faulty information about stocks being provided to the cabinet, and then them making decisions about export, and then 3 months later about importing. Same with wheat, right? So it's exactly that.
That's because we have never, despite the fact, I've sat in ECC meetings, I remember, where Hafiz Sheikh actually asked them, okay, you want to import sugar, what are the stocks? And the guy the person who was supposed to ask the secretary looked blank. So I still remember Hafiz actually said, you've got a cell phone, go outside and call and get a figure. And it took 15 minutes of back and forth to try and get a figure. And I don't think it got an accurate figure. So the point is this. And this is something that I argued at that point and later too. Why don't we have stock reports? Like in the US, stock reports come out all the time. I mean, they are available all the time. In fact, commodity traders are looking for them because they're basing their trade on those reports. So why don't we have these processes? ECC, for example, never gets a stock report except at the time when they're doing a transaction. Why don't we have regular stock reports given by the Ministry of Finance or whichever ministry? in charge ministry. So these are important things to talk about. So next time, inshallah, we'll talk about them and let's get deeper into these things. Thank you, Sakib. As always, a great pleasure talking to you. And
Likewise, Nadeem.
continue this dialogue. We'll continue.
Thank you.
Thank you.